Hey everyone, welcome back to Here Apologetics. As always, brought to you by you with support on Patron.com. Today I'm joined by Josh Yen. We're going to be reviewing the recent debate between Alex O'Connor and Bishop Robert Barron. So it should be a lot of fun. But what's up, Josh?
I'm doing absolutely phenomenal. Football's been saved. Everything's been saved. Absolutely phenomenal week. How are you, Zach?
I'm good. It's been a crazy week, I guess, in England when you have this debate dropping and the debate over the Super League and saving with Chelsea and all those saints over there that kept European football pure. So appreciate that. But it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely looking forward to it.
Yeah, so today we're going to be doing a debate review there was a debate on Unbelievable between Alex O'Connor, the Cosmic Skeptic, and Bishop Robert Barron. Specifically, we're looking at a few different things that Alex said with like the existence of God, faith, evil, things like that. So before we get into the clips, which we'll pull up very briefly here, do you have any kind of like preliminary thoughts, Josh, before we just dive straight in?
I think it was an absolutely phenomenal debate, very interesting. There's a lot of new stuff as well as a lot of old stuff that I was kind of exposed to in this debate. It was an absolutely phenomenal debate, and I think both interlocutors had presented themselves really, really well and were very prepared for the debate. So generally a very, very good debate. And if you haven't watched it, just check it out if this interview makes it seem, or this discussion makes it seem a bit more interesting for you. Make sure you check it out if you haven't already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a link down below if you haven't seen the full debate, but I imagine you would by now. But there's a lot of fun. So we're going to get into this first bit where Alex is going to talk about contingency arguments and kind of hint towards God of the gaps almost, at least I think. But let's get started.
Spelled out.
Well, I agree with many of the implications of what Bishop Barron is saying. I mean, for instance, I very much agree with the idea of an expanse in knowledge essentially never being able to satisfy our curious minds. And there's that image of an expanding circle. As it gets bigger and bigger, so do the edges. You know, the edges, the frontiers of our knowledge get bigger and bigger, such that there are more and more things we don't know. Now, that's one of the things that I find so incredible and beautiful about the scientific and philosophical endeavors that we partake in, because there's just endless things to discover. I find it quite strange how the Christian might be able to say that, yes, our circle is getting bigger and bigger and the frontiers of our knowledge are getting bigger and bigger. But once we get to that certain point, there it is. We've got it. We have the full circle. We know what it is. We're now satisfied. The thing about atheism is that for most atheists that I know, it's more of a passive thing than an active thing. It's more just saying, listen, I'm not the one who has to do the explaining here. I'm perfectly content to say that our knowledge will continually expand, and with it, so will the frontiers. If somebody else comes along and claims that they have the answer, that they have the thing that kind of that cuts off that progress and says we've found the answer, we know what's at the base of all reality, then they better have some good evidence for it. And there are plenty of evidences that are put forward and many arguments that are made, such as the contingency argument, which
yeah, this is a good place to start, just like the first bit on this. So what's your take, Josh, on kind of like this first bit of what Alex is saying?
Well, I think this part of what Alex is saying does have some sense of it is a reasonable response to what Bishop Barron was saying. I think is perhaps the first thing which would come to mind. And first of all, I think he's perhaps the most biggest, the thing that he's saying is perhaps the God of the gaps thing, which he is put forward here, is saying well, okay, you have this expanding knowledge, but why should we just put God at the end of it? Why not just continue allowing our knowledge or this horizon to continue expanding? And that's one of the main things I think he's saying here. And first of all, I'll perhaps give my thoughts on what this God of the gaps thing is. And I do think that God of the gaps is one of the things which is oftenly overused and misused in modern day discussions and debates. And I'm not here to say that God of the gaps is always all right or God of the gaps is always wrong. However, I would say that there are situations where God of the gaps is not actually God of the gaps in the sense of a negative light. For example, I think I heard this on some other podcast, some other discussion before. I forgot which one it was, but sometimes what atheists like to call God of the gaps is actually just good abductive reasoning. It's like if you are looking for a cause of the universe, or if you reach a point where there is indeed a first cause, it would not be God of the gaps reasoning to suggest that God is the first cause, even though we cannot definitively or empirically demonstrate that there's a physical or whatever, there's a God there. Suggesting that God as the best explanation, while it might be seen or suggest as God of the gaps, would not actually be God of the gaps at least in a negative light. That said, if someone just says, well, there's lightning in the sky, must be God, then that's a completely different thing. So I think that's some place we could start, and that's something that we should all bear in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like if we're going to accept like a contingency argument, we have like stage one. There's some sort of like necessary ground that doesn't depend on anything outside of itself for its existence. At some point, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, if you accept stage one, like a lot of people do, you're going to get to this point where there is no further explanation. We can keep asking questions, but at some point, you're going to hit this like end of explanation, and maybe like a brute fact or like a necessary being. And like some would say that maybe we could explain why God is necessary. But like it seems like if we're going to accept stage one of a contingency argument, this is going to happen regardless of whether you're a Christian or an atheist. So yeah, and then anything else you want to add before we go a little bit further?
I'd just like to perhaps just focus a bit on Bishop Barron's thing, because I think that it's also quite nice to think about what Alex is responding to as well. And what I kind of say is that, or at least what I think Bishop Barron is saying, is that, well, there is a drive for things like truth and others. And he's just basically saying, well, there is this drive within us, which is pointing towards some truth, some extrinsic or something which is outside of ourselves, some truth that we are trying to search towards, and everything that we see or everything that we find does not satisfy our desire for the truth, and hence we're continuously searching, we're kind of pursuing this, and there's this frontier which is continuously expanding, and we have to continue following it, and at the end of it you will finally see some ultimate frontier, something which goes beyond that frontier. I think he says something like, and he says, well, beyond that frontier points towards the existence of some fundamental truth or some fundamental reality which does actually satisfy the human desire for knowledge. And that's just something to keep in mind, because he does indeed raise two arguments, I think, Bishop Barron. He raises the contingency argument and also this other frontier argument, which is, I have to admit, I'm less familiar with it, but I think that's something to keep in mind as well. And if you're interested in that, make sure you watch the debate.
Yeah, there's actually this interesting in Bishop Barron's conversation with Jordan Peterson, where he talks about like how he thinks the West is the first culture to believe that we can find all of our satisfaction or desires within ourselves. So it's interesting that it kind of overlays more. But this next bit's really interesting,
which I've discussed on your show in more detail before, Justin, with Cameron Batuzzi, of course. The thing about it is that my job as an atheist is essentially to pick holes rather than to necessarily present an argument to say why it's false. It's more of an undercutting approach than a rebutting approach is what I like to use. With contingency, when I was on your show before, there's an assumption, for instance, that contingent things exist, which is an assumption that often goes unanalyzed. The idea that actually I could have not been born, or that this glass that I've got on the table here could have been a mug instead, or something like this, is how contingency is often described. But as I spoke about before on your show, Justin, it's not clear that that's necessarily true. If, for instance, we live in a deterministic universe where everything is following a causal chain, whereby it actually couldn't have been different. So there are certain assumptions that I think often go unanalyzed in these arguments. And you can have an entire discussion about the nature of contingent objects and whether they exist. But you can also have an entire discussion, if you just grant that they do, and say, is it not the case, as David Hume suggested, that if you have each contingent object explained by another contingent object, you've explained the whole? And there's plenty of discussion to be had there. The problem is that these discussions are so large and so wide-ranging that to say, actually, no, we've solved the problem, we've solved all of these holes that you can pick. We're going to plug them up with God, and not just as a God of the gaps, not just as a, well, we don't really know, let's just say that God did it, but as a kind of, no, this is the best explanation for all of these things. I fail to see it.
It's interesting here because he talks a little bit about like just saying, well, why think the contingent facts exist in the first place, and then he gets into like the whole infinite regress idea. So what are your thoughts, Josh?
I do think that the contingent facts, and I do think that Bishop Barron does say this, is that what contingent facts that Bishop Barron is using is not necessarily contingent in this sense of modality or the common sense of contingent facts that we normally like to hear or we're normally used to in perhaps possible world theories or things like that. Rather, what Bishop Barron is using is like perhaps a more traditional, or perhaps not the traditional, but the literal definition of contingency, which is more like, it is dependence. It's a dependence relationship. So whether or not it is deterministic or not, what you do see is that you either have a temporal chain of causal events, or you have a hierarchical causal chain of events. And in the temporal sense, you get to things like the kalam, and in the hierarchical sense, you get to some things like what Fester says. It's like kind of, you have things which is right now in this current state of affair at this current time, where our individual actions or layers on this state of affairs are dependent on other things. And I think that's what Bishop Barron is also pointing towards. It's like the contingency of, well, we are dependent not like temporally on our mother, but rather we are dependent on certain status or certain things in our which then carries on into different levels in existence. And ultimately there has to be a fundamental grounding for this contingency. And as a result has to be, you get to this fundamental grounding kind of necessary or this fundamental thing which is not dependent on further things and hence is not contingent. So I think that yes, the determinant thing is a thing in some cases, but not necessarily applicable to the argument that Bishop Barron is saying. And I think you wrote something about modal collapse. So do you want to carry on from there?
Yeah, no, there were a couple of things I noted that were like a little bit different than yours that I thought about listening to this. And one was this idea is what seems like Alex is just embracing a modal collapse where like if you adopt like a deterministic theory of everything, you get to this fact where like everything is necessary. So say like for the example, I went on a run this morning. I think I ran for like 24 minutes and 53 seconds. Like, well, in Alex's theory, I couldn't have run for 24 minutes and 52 seconds or 24 minutes and 54 seconds. It was just necessary. I had to do that, which is really interesting because it gets into things with like maybe like moral responsibility, where like Hitler killed 6 million Jews because he had to, not because he chose to, not in like a free will decision. So that's really interesting. And then the other thing that I thought about was Alex in his debate with Trent Horn, I believe it was, Trent was introducing some sort of like causal principle. And Alex talked about how like quantum mechanics undermined this because you have in like quantum mechanics with like, just certain things, you have very chancy events happen where there's no explanation for why they do. There's some sort of cause, but then why does it turn out this way instead of another way? Well, it's just chance. There's no explanation. And it seems like to me that if you're going to argue that, like Alex did in that debate with Trent Horn, I believe, you'd have to go back and fact check me on this, then you couldn't use this deterministic theory of everything because there's things without explanation. So it seems like you can't have like an indeterministic theory of quantum mechanics and then also like embrace like everything is deterministic. There's no contingent facts. Like Alex seems to be arguing here. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I first have to applaud your strength of going on a 24-minute run in the morning. I have been trying to get myself to do exercise for ages. I just haven't been able to get myself out the door to go for any run. So I have to applaud you on that for the
Appreciate it.
On the assumption that you actually have free will, of course. But I do also agree with you that free will is ultimately, I think, perhaps fundamentally the most important thing in existence or our world right now. And that is definitely something which cannot be accepted under a world of modal collapse, or especially a deterministic universe. And I completely agree with you on your discussions on the idea of quantum indeterminacy, because I think that even if we have a random universe, it is very difficult to say that it's completely determined as well. There is a sense of there's this sense of contradiction here, and not perhaps an explicit contradiction, but there is indeed a sense of, how do I say it? There's a problem. There's a conflict between the idea of a completely random universe where there is a fundamental, and of course there's a lot of different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Like there's some quantum mechanics which does say that it's ultimately determined, although it does seem to have random things on top of it. There's some like pilot wave underneath of it, which seems to be determined. And there's other interpretations of it. But if you take it in an indeterministic fashion, then I would completely agree with you. It's like you cannot have these two. Well, it's very difficult to have these two views together at the same time. So completely agree with you on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you kind of add on a little bit before we go to Alex's thoughts on faith?
Not really. I think it's pretty good. I think they cover it pretty well in the debate, and I think we've covered it quite well as well.
Definitely. Well, let's look at what Alex says on faith now.
But the Bible witnesses to people that have had the experience of the breakthrough of the unconditioned.
But I feel like, interesting as it may be, this is off track from the original point, which is to say, look, I mean, I think what you're making is a distinction without difference here. You say that faith needs to be distinct from reason, otherwise there's no point in having the term, right? We're talking about something that's distinct from the average kind of, here's a reason for believing something, so I believe it. And you've said, well, no, it's not that I kind of use reason to come to this conclusion. I just have a context of reason from which I arrive at this belief, is I think the terminology you used. I'm failing to see the distinction here. In other words, the question is quite simple. It's like, when it comes to something, some proposition which you would say you need faith to believe, whether that be a religious claim or a claim that a person you've met is making, you either have sufficient reason to believe what they're saying, in which case you're relying on reason, or you don't, in which case, sure, you're relying on faith, but then faith would entail a lack of sufficient reason.
Interesting stuff here. So it's like the faith and reason distinction or lack thereof. So what are your thoughts on this, Josh?
Well, I think faith is one of those things which I have to admit is one of the weirdest parts in the Bible. And I think it's very good for them to have covered this topic. And I think that faith, when you come to faith, I think everyone approaches what faith means to them in a different way. And I don't want to say anyone's idea of faith is right or wrong per se. I don't want to go around and say, well, you have some like idea of faith and that's dreadful, or I have an idea of faith and that's like mine's better than yours, right? I think faith is indeed a very personal thing. And what I think is that if faith goes against reason, then you have a conflict here. But if faith is in line or compatible with reason, then you have concord, and you could develop your faith off of reason or develop your reason off of faith, as long as none of them have a explicit contradiction. And what I like to think is that what faith is best seen in a relationship, and that's what Bishop Barron says, by perhaps formulating in a slightly different way, in the sense that, I have a relationship with you, Zach. I have a relationship with my parents. I have a relationship with those around me, and of course, whenever you raise the topic of there are people around me, I have a relationship with you, I have a relationship with my parents, and different things like that. There's firstly always going to be a problem of solipsism, or a brain in the vat hypothesis, which is almost, at least I think, commonly accepted as it's impossible to completely defeat that kind of possibility. I mean, it is perhaps very, very, very improbable for that to be true, but there is indeed a possibility, just a really far chance, that there is actually no one else, and everything is just kind of like created around you, and you don't have anything around you. But that's why I like to see faith as, is like, yes, there is that possibility, but that doesn't stop me from having that relationship with you. All reason points to you guys being around me. I have that faith with the reason to then accept that you guys exist around me, if you get what I mean, to have that relationship with you. And in the same way, God is like that as well. God exists. Even if you can't prove 100% that God exists, I mean, perhaps if the ontological argument was sound and stuff like that, then maybe God exists as well. But imagine that doesn't work. Imagine you have 70% reason for God to exist. You get to there and you're like, well, that's the faith that I have to take myself the rest of the way. It's not to say reason doesn't exist, but reason gets you a good way there. And that last problem, just in the solipsist case, that last gap which you use to get to have a relationship with others, is the same way that you get to have a relationship with God. That's a faith that I like to present. And I think that's something that Alex perhaps is not looking at in his critique here.
Yeah, one of the things I'd love to ask Alex is like, does reason require like 100% certainty? Because you talked a little bit about like just like these thought experiments like solipsism or like the evil demon, where it's like, well, it seems like these things are the case, like that, like maybe like the external world is real or the other minds exist, but we don't really know with 100% certainty. So it seems like we're gonna not have that 100% certainty. So do we believe in the external world by reason or by faith? Because it seems like by Alex's kind of like putting these two against each other, then it has to either be by reason or faith. And if I don't have 100% certainty, would it just be faith that the external world exists? So it'd just be really interesting to think about, because Descartes, and with like his thought experiments, he kind of goes against the scholastics here and says, hey, you know, our sensory experiences aren't completely reliable, and he gets into all these different thought experiments. So I think like faith involves commitment, because it's like, well, we have this good reason to think this, which is like what Bishop Barron talks about in his analogies with regards to like what faith is in this debate. So it's just really interesting to think about, because like I think that faith is kind of like the end result almost, whereas like reason can get us to a point where it's like, yeah, I have good reason to think that I'm talking to a person named Josh Shen on the computer right now, but I don't know with 100% certainty. I could be deceived. He could be not like a philosophical zombie or something like that. So it's like faith almost like bridges the gap from like what we know to what we think we know. It's kind of at least somehow to some degree what I think of it. And like I just like in the notes, I got the definition of pistis in terms of like the Greek definition of faith, and it talks about faith being like persuasion, moral conviction of a truth, reliance upon Christ for salvation, an extension of the system of the gospel itself, assurance, belief, to believe, faith, fidelity, like things like that. So I don't see faith and reason as like completely at odds with each other, or else I think we'd have to accept, and if they were, I think we'd have to accept things like the external world existing by faith, not by reason. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on this.
I was thinking about what you said, also made me think about something. It's like, I don't think it's possible for anyone to possibly live solely on reason. And the reason why I say that is actually because everyone's belief systems are based on some fundamental presuppositions or some fundamental axioms. I don't think anyone could possibly go around it. If you ask anyone a certain degree backwards in their themes, they're going to have to accept some certain things which cannot be proved by further things behind them. It's perhaps, like we say, like the belief in other minds, or perhaps in mathematics, you do have some axioms like A plus A equals B, or like 2A when it's finite mathematics, it goes to infinite mathematics and everything goes kind of a bit wonky. But I mean, in a normal situation, it's like you have these fundamental axioms. Well, why do you believe in that? And of course, you could say, well, some things in reality, sorry, my voice has gone a bit, but some things in reality does apply to these presuppositions, or these ideas, axioms do seem to apply to reality. But then you also have to ask, well, what are the fundamental axioms for that belief as well? And when you get to the fundamental part of your theories or your worldview, you do reach these fundamental things which you can't really explain, but you just accept kind of a priori. And when you get to that, it's like you do have to have some kind of faith to accept that, even if it is reasonable faith. And also, just in going another way, and as you've said as well, it's like faith is also, most importantly, I think, in Christianity, it's a relationship as well with God. Like, it's not like Christianity is not all about its arguments. It's not all about its like the existence of God. Of course, God's existence is very, very important, and I don't want to be quoted to say anything else, but the Bible is mainly focused on your relationship with God, at least the New Testament. And that just demonstrates that if you build your relationship with God solely on rational arguments, it's like trying to build a house with only one pillar in it. It's going to collapse. In the same way, your relationship with God has to go beyond that fundamental reason, and also go into other areas where you're actually learning more about him. You're interacting with him, praying to him, meditating on it. And that's something that faith also covers, where rationality has its boundaries, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, I think like a good thought experiment is like, how do you avoid the regress if you're going to say that you believe everything based off reason? Like Callum in the chat just gave like a bunch of examples of things that you can't just be like scientifically measured. But it's like, so like I believe that I'm talking to a person named Josh on the computer now. Oh, why do I believe that? I believe that because I believe my computer's reliable. Why do I believe that? Well, I believe that my senses are reliable, and it's what I believe my senses are reliable. It seems like I can connect to the external world, but how do I know that? Well, at some point we're going to run into this like end of explanation. Something that Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron talked about that I was listening to just this morning. So yeah, it's a good stuff to think about. So we'll get into this next bit where they're going to talk about the problem of evil for a little bit. So we're going to play Alex here.
Atheism doesn't claim to have any explanatory power. Okay. What we can say is that we would expect, if there is a world in which there are conscious creatures, which, you know, I recognize some people think is unlikely given atheism generally, but if that's our premise, what would we expect to find? Well, we'd have no reason not to expect there to be all kinds of unpredictable and seemingly arbitrary suffering. It's not me who has to do the explaining here, you know, and you're right, Justin, that during a tragedy like this, you find that people come to religion and people go away from religion. That falls in the realm, I think, of a psychological discussion. It's like people might come to God because they find it's a good way to deal with the immense tragedy of the suffering that we're facing. But that says nothing about whether or not religion provides a sufficient explanation for why it's happening or justification for why it's happening. Because here,
yeah, I think just very briefly, like I'd love to comment for just a second. Like I totally, like if we're going to make like an evidential argument, I'd grant that like atheism explains evil. And then the question is, does theism explain evil? So I just wanted to add that little thought. I don't know if you have anything you want to add here, Josh, before we get into like the rest of what he says.
Perhaps I could build I think we could continue on because I think I have a thought which builds on this, but also requires some other stuff here. So yeah, I think we go on.
Okay, I just wanted to add that because, like, with an evidential argument, you kind of have like, well, evil is expected under atheism; it's not under theism. Therefore, atheism is like more likely to be true. It's kind of like a basis of like an evidential argument that he's about to make.
Because here's the problem: in order to assert that there is an all-loving God who is supervising this, and because I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur. If we're going to assert that there is a benevolent being who is allowing this to occur, then it must follow that there is morally sufficient reason for this to occur. In the United Kingdom, just today, we have 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus, and the Christian has to say that this is morally justified, and they're welcome to do so with reference to theodicies, by saying that this is pain. People like to speak kind of abstractly about how pain and suffering might be necessary to obtain certain goods, or it'll be compensated in the afterlife, or something of this sort. But we have to say specifically on an issue like this that yes, this specifically 100,000 people who have died of COVID have done so because God allowed it. That's the first thing that needs to be admitted by the Christian, and most Christians have no problem accepting that. The difficulty comes in the second proposition, which is that it's justified. This needs to happen, or this should have happened, or at least there's no kind of moral qualm with this having been allowed to happen. That's the problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, this is good. I think it's a good place to stop with regards to this little bit. So what are your thoughts here, Josh, on Alex kind of introducing the problem of evil?
Well, I think the problem of evil, and I think he presents it in a very eloquent way in the sense that the problem of evil has and will always be perhaps the most significant emotional challenge for Christianity. I'm not going to deny that. I think that, and it goes back to a psychological point, it's like, well, what's the biggest reason for why people come to God? Might be suffering, not necessarily. What's the biggest reason for why people leave God? Might be suffering, not necessarily. Both of these things seem to be completely independent of whether God exists or not. And that's one thing that I want to put aside for now. You just keep that in mind and put that aside. Now, at the other hand, we also have to talk about what he's arguing. He's saying, well, an atheistic worldview explains or doesn't need to, in his words, like to say, doesn't need to explain or doesn't have to have a complete explanation of all the suffering and all the evil in the world. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to explain it because perhaps it isn't even suffering, because suffering has negative connotations. It just is. It is just pain. It is just, well, it's quite difficult to say without saying the word suffering, but you get what I mean. It is just pain. Yeah. It is those stimuli and stuff like that, right? And that's one thing. On the other hand, we could turn to a lot of theodicies and a lot of things like that. But one thing I like to think about first is something that I like to call the theodicy of merit. It's like, well, what exactly do humans deserve? What exactly do we see on a Christian picture? Because I think the problem of evil, it's too often that the atheist likes to propose a problem of evil, has the evil, has the loving God, but doesn't take into consideration what exactly is that loving God, right? Because a lot of the times we see the traditional one is God is love, God is all powerful, there is evil. But that God is love and God is all powerful, or God is good and God is all powerful, is a significant reduction. It's a significant, I want to almost say, straw man of the Christian narrative. The Christian narrative is so much more than just God is love, God is powerful, is all powerful. There's so much other connotations to that thing, to the concept of God, which explains the suffering. And it's important, I think, that whenever we talk about the problem of evil, that both of us first assume the Christian narrative and then to find problems with it, instead of just saying, well, God is just good and God is just love, and well, let's just only use those two things. Because looking at it at face value seems a bit weaker. But when you consider other factors, consider the Christian narrative, then you could solve these, or you could at least weaken the problem of evil, and that turns to the theodicy, especially the theodicy of merit. And the theodicy of merit, as the name suggests, it's like, well, what exactly do humans deserve? And what I like to say is, well, you were first given life before you've done anything to deserve it. On the Christian narrative, since the beginning that we've born, we've sinned. Like, no one on this earth has gone without sinning for a significant or infinitesimally small time. Of course, if you're born, maybe that first time you haven't sinned. But then you look at what the Christian morality, the code is, it's like, well, do not hate, do not do not steal, do not hurt, do not harm other people. I'm sure a lot of kids, a lot of young kids do. And I'm not saying that that makes them deserve the suffering as much as everyone else, but there is a sin from babies to adulthood, and that sin just grows. We've started off on almost a blank slate with a life that no one has actually done anything to deserve. And all we've done is sin and fall short from the glory of God. If you look at it from that perspective, instead of the perspective that we deserve life, we deserve beauty, we deserve pleasure and all that things, if you look at it from the Christian perspective, that we are actually fallen human beings, the question should not be why is there so much suffering, but why hasn't God carried out his justice on humans and just ended the human project in the beginning? Because if he ended the human project in the beginning, he would have been completely, I think, justified to do so, because humans are absolutely fallen. God has no reason, or he doesn't need to, he has no obligation to send his son to die for us on the cross. He has no obligation to sustain this world any longer than it already has been sustained. He could have just wiped it out in the beginning when humans started sinning. Human project is over. What exactly do you go to, if you got what I mean?
Yeah.
You need to start with the Christian perspective, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great because like Tato just put in the live chat where you start with like the Christian narrative, which is a good place to start because like if we're talking about what best explains reality, Christianity or atheism, it seems like just like in the beginning here, at least in the Christian narrative, it would explain these sufferings that for us being sinful, we don't deserve this best perfect life. So I agree with you. And then like even further, like I think there are all these philosophical like theodicies or defenses that we could get into to kind of explain like, well, why is there this suffering? So I'll just list a few here that I've kind of seen or discovered. Like Ganta has a good list on Belief Map where he talks about different things like there being free will in a choice arena, the forming of our character, God's atonement for people, worldly people turning to seek God, love bonds, fortune and suffering, solidarity with Christ in suffering, true evil conquering stories and knowable unfolding natural order, sacrifice for good causes, being in use to those in need, and appreciation of heaven. So I like what you did, Josh, because you started just with like the Christian narrative, because the debate is what best explains reality, Christianity or atheism, because the Christian narrative does, I think, explain these things, maybe not in the way that we'd prefer, but it does, appealing to like our sinfulness and such. And then there are just all these like philosophical defenses we can make as well. So yeah, I like what you added, Josh, there.
Yes,
and
I think. Yep,
I was to say if you don't have anything but feel free to, like, I'm not in a rush. So what were we going to say?
Yeah, I was perhaps going to say, and I'm not sure if there was actually a thing that I could use this later on, but building on that free will point, I do think, and you know, last time when we were talking about animal suffering, I said it leads to greater good, but I think I have since then developed perhaps a more complex view of it, and my new idea is that it does not necessarily need to lead to greater good. The role of evil does not need to lead to good every single time for it to be justified. Because going back to what I think we've said in the beginning, that the importance of free will when we were talking about contingency, what we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the importance of free will? How important is free will? And free will is not just some random concept that comes up from absolutely nowhere. It's the fundamental cornerstone for our relationship with God. It's a fundamental cornerstone for our moral responsibility. It's a fundamental cornerstone for everything. And we can also, I think, with that in mind, also imagine another world where there's evil and there's opportunity to do good, but everyone chooses to do evil and there's no good out of it. But does that mean that world is not justified? I don't think so, because everyone in that world has had the opportunity to use that evil to do greater good. So it's not necessarily there's good in the end, because that world does not have any good whatsoever coming out from that evil. But at the same time, those free people had the choice to use that suffering to become greater in their relationship with God. And that's something that I've been thinking as well in my life as well. It's like, well, once you accept as a Christian, you see Paul, and he's perhaps one of the best expressions of suffering and people facing persecution. And he says, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I think that's one of the most commonly overlooked phrases in the Bible, because a lot of people don't like to hide that part of persecution and suffering, hide that away from Christianity. But that is a very important thing that we need to think about. And it's like, well, every suffering that we experience on this world, I think, at least for me, has led me to further appreciate the beauty and the sacrifice that God had on the cross. Finite beings suffering finitely. I mean, at the end of the day, how bad can it possibly get? But for an infinite being of infinite power to come down from heaven to suffer in the most embarrassing, shameful way on the cross, to slowly bleed and suffocate to death, it's an infinite God who had the potential to get away with all of that thing in a click second, but decided to die on the cross to suffer for our sins. Our understanding of suffering gives us a greater opportunity, whether we take it or not, to reach sublimation, to reach a further relationship with God, and to bring good into this world. And as a result, I think that even if that evil does bring absolutely no good at the end of the day, that opportunity, that free will to use that evil is sufficient reason to justify it, regardless of how humans react to it, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we'll go to this next little bit here with regards to furthermore on the problem of evil.
Among many. God's not one little fussy cause among many, but God is ipsum esse, more like the author of a novel than a character in it, right? And so Dostoevsky allowing all sorts of darkness within his great novels, but still having a commanding viewpoint. It's an analogy that limps like all analogies, but God's more like that than one fussy character among many within the novel.
Well, yeah, I mean, when Dostoevsky allows the character to be mistreated, it's certainly good for the plot line, but it's not good for the character. And that's the point here. The Christian, at least the theodicy that's been proposed here, is one saying that evil is allowed because some greater good can be brought from it, which means the corollary of this is that anytime an evil exists, anytime bad exists, it exists precisely because some good is going to be brought out of it. That is to say, evil is actually an indication that something good is happening, which means that all of these evil instances, and I specifically avoided using instances that have the complication of free will. So I wouldn't use something like the Holocaust, but I use something like the coronavirus or something like a miscarriage. The implication of this, the implication of saying that evil is always an indication that some good is being obtained, is to say that these are things worth celebrating. Anytime that one of these things happens, anytime that a tragedy, and of course you can see it as an emotional tragedy, a Christian is still perfectly entitled to say that they're upset by this, that they're sad, that they're angry, that they don't understand the reasons, but ultimately philosophically they have to say this is a cause for celebration. Thank goodness that this has been allowed to happen so that we draw out some good. Thank goodness that there's 100,000 people in the United Kingdom have been killed by this virus.
Yeah, what do you think about this? There's a lot of interesting things here.
Well, I think this is perhaps why I was thinking about whether I raised the point just now or later, because I think it's the idea of the greater good is responded to, I think, with the previous point that I was putting forth. And it doesn't matter. And even when he says things which do not have anything to do with free will, that doesn't defeat the theodicy, because as I've said, I think I've demonstrated in my previous theodicy, it's possible for there to be evil existing as a stepping stone or an opportunity for people to act freely based upon that, to reach greater good, to reach greater sublimation. So I think that this theodicy, or this, actually no, not a theodicy, this attack or this argument is insufficient when faced with under scrutiny. And of course there is the emotional side that is there, and there's the emotional problem of, oh my gosh, this we should celebrate. But I mean, that's just kind of extreme. And I completely agree with Bishop Barron's response. Like, you've just gone absolutely beyond it. And it seems like you've been possessed by the spirit of Hitchens or something like that. But I mean, yeah, what's your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, the interesting idea I kind of thought about as he was talking is, like, he talks about this idea, and he does this numerous times, this debate where anytime there's an evil, there must be some sort of good for God to be like all loving. So he talks about, like, the example of, I think it was in this bit where there's a tsunami and a baby's stripped from a woman's arms, and it's like this really sad, tragic thing. And it's like, I think Alex is kind of thinking, well, God, there must be some sort of good that comes from that. And I think a lot of the times when people like will pose the problem of evil, they think it's like this direct good where it's going to like directly apply on like this exact person. And maybe that's the case, but I also think like one of the things I thought about is like the value of like an ordered universe. So like, for example, like the tsunami that occurs, it's not really random where it's like, oh, God's like, oh, I'm going to throw this tsunami on the earth right now because I feel like it. It's more of, we live in an ordered universe that has these certain laws that certain things like tsunamis are going to develop, and it's just going to happen as it unfolds with, say, like natural laws and processes. So I think like living in like an ordered and discoverable universe is part of the reason why there are these like natural evils that exist. Because it seems like for there to be no tsunamis, we'd have to either live in like a non-ordered universe or a universe that would have some sort of order that would allow for like no evils at all. And like you have like the whole butterfly effect thing. So that's kind of like one of the things I thought about here that I don't think Bishop Barron really brought up, but is an interesting kind of response, especially natural evil is like the value of like an ordered universe. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
And I like to, since they've so kindly brought in Dostoevsky here, I'd just like to say that I'll just have to say that they could also have turned back to Dostoevsky's own response to freedom and also suffering, because Dostoevsky has suffered significantly in his life. Like 2 of his 3 kids died before they were 3 years old from epilepsy, a condition that he passed on to them, and he felt so much guilt about it that it was perhaps the single most strong reason and his inspiration for writing the Brothers Karamazov. It's because his 2 kids died before they were 3, and one died at 3 months old, I think, and he suffered suffering throughout his life. And his response to suffering is, well, compare that suffering to the beauty of Christ. And you're like, yes, there's evil in this world. Yes, there's suffering. But the love and glory and the beauty which comes with this, the idea that the greatest being in the entire universe would step down from heaven to die for us, it's just so much greater than all this suffering that even if it was true that this suffering existed, that there was absolutely no justification for it, all suffering in this world would be a speck in comparison to the ideal of Christ dying for us and resurrecting from the grave. So even if there was absolutely no theodicies on this world, I think that's one of the reasons why he said that even if there was no explanation or there's no necessarily rational reason for us to believe in God, that he'll still believe in Christ over anything else, is because the beauty of Christ is so immense that if you compare suffering to Christ, it's a tiny drop in the ocean compared to the sea of that love. And that's just what I think Dostoevsky would say. And that's just the image that Dostoevsky is presenting. It's like, yes, there's suffering in this world, accept it, but also accept Christ as well. And that suffering the strength of that suffering just decreases significantly. And it's just understanding that, which is one of the key to understanding the rest of the thing. But actually, there's also something else I want to say is that, well, actually, what was I think I completely forgot about what I was trying to say after that. But yeah, I think that, do you have anything to say about that? I'll try to think about.
No, I mean, I think it's pretty good, just like a pretty good overview. So I mean, I don't really have too much to add with it's like specifics. The next clip is really interesting where he talks about like death being a good thing under Christianity. So you have anything you want to add? Do you find your thoughts, or do you want to look at this next?
No,
bit?
I think listening more to Alex would probably help me refine my thoughts again.
Okay, let's listen to this next bit. This is really interesting.
Ever, life is thrown at us.
Well, allow me to answer both of your points there. The first point about Jesus weeping, don't misunderstand me. It's certainly compatible with the kind of, I suppose you would see it as a caricature of the Christian position. But if that were the position, it's certainly compatible with it to cry, to be sad, to be upset. The archetypal example here, I think, would be the crucifixion. If you were present at the crucifixion, it was a horrific, tragic event. Everybody's weeping, everybody's crying, apart from the people initiating the thing, of course. Jesus is suffering. It's a horrible, horrible event. And yet it's still celebrated in the modern day. It's celebrated on Good Friday because we recognize that, yeah, it's a tragic event that's worth weeping over, but ultimately speaking, because this brought about the greatest good, it's worth celebrating this solemn and tragic event. And that's what I'm talking about. Your father dying or of coronavirus or something, you can weep. You can weep and weep and weep. But as a Christian, you have to deep down accept that it's worth it, that this is a good thing, that I'm glad that God's will is being done here. Because otherwise you're saying that you're not glad when God's will is being done, which seems to be out of character for a Christian. I would just add that you're perfectly entitled to ask what consolation does the atheist give. I remember when Christopher Hitchens...
I don't think we need to get into this atheist part because it's not really relevant to our response. But Alex's background is very aesthetic. I just kind of noticed that listening to this clip. What are your thoughts here overall, Josh?
I think there's one phrase that I should refer him to, is to live is Christ and to die is gain. When you accept the Christian worldview, you accept that as well. And I don't think there's any problem with actually celebrating death and celebrating the beauty of death. And it's like, well, death is only one of the journeys or one of the places in the long path that which is life. It's like you only like death is only one stage. You go beyond beyond death, and what you see is beautiful. It's an eternal relationship with God, and that's something that I think we always have to think about. It's like and let's take about the celebration about the death of the father, right? It's like if it's true that your father was going to heaven after he died, surely you should celebrate. I mean, of course, it's going to be sad, but at the same time, it is worthy of celebration. If you got what I mean. Like if I died, I don't want people to be mourning about me forever. It's like they should celebrate because I mean I would go to heaven, and if not, and I do end up in hell, then justice has been done, and well, what am I to complain about it? If you got what I mean. It's like at the end of the day, justice is done, and someone's in heaven. So I think that's the solution to that, the celebration thing.
Yeah. Yeah, my father talks about like how one of the first times he ever went to a Christian funeral when he was like, I think in like his 20s, there was all this celebration. He was so confused with like what was going on because he just realized like, well, as a Christian, like to die is gain. So like I think Alex is partially right, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't mourn when someone passes away in this life. Like it's still really hard for us who are stuck on this side of life. So I don't know. It seemed like to me, like I didn't really get what Alex was arguing at this bit. Though it was interesting. So do you have any last thoughts? We can get into this last bit.
Let's get into the last bit. Yeah.
Awesome. Here's the last bit where Alex kind of gives his conclusion on why he thinks atheism best explains reality, in a sense.
If you think there are philosophical reasons that are kind of really compellingly leading you to believe that some form of God, and from that you have to make sense of the world, think, sure, it makes sense to be a Christian, right? But if you accept the premise that I put forward, which is if you start with the suffering, it doesn't seem to lead to God, then the question becomes, what is more obviously present? And to me, when I wake up, when I reflect on the state of the world, when I reflect on the nature of contingency and the nature of causation, but I also reflect on the nature of death and suffering and misery, the thing that's more obviously real and more undeniably real, and therefore I think a better philosophical starting point, more justified starting ground, is the existence of the suffering. If I cannot get from that existence of suffering, which is undeniable, nobody can deny that that exists. If I can't find a route from that suffering to the existence of a loving God, then I can't use Christianity to make sense of the world that I find myself in. You're welcome to go in the other direction if you like, but if you share in my view that suffering is so obviously present that it should be the start of philosophy, then I don't think that you can make sense of it with Christianity alone.
What do you think about suffering being like the fundamental starting point of philosophy, Josh?
Sorry, I think my mic went a bit haywire. Okay, I think it should be good. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
fine.
So essentially, I think that I'm happily accepting that if suffering is the start of your philosophy. I mean, I don't think I'll necessarily call that suffering. I'll call that psychology. But I mean, if you do accept suffering as your beginning, I think it could easily turn towards God. I mean, through the theodicies, and also the problem of suffering is as much a problem of atheism as it is a problem of Christianity, especially from a psychological perspective. It's like, well, we know suffering is bad, but why exactly is suffering bad? And Alex seems to be presenting it as a very objective problem, not just some subjective problem, which is subjectively dismissed, or a subjective preference of the human race. I mean, in order for his formulation to stand, I think he has to accept some sense of there's something objectively wrong with that suffering. But when you accept that there's something objectively wrong with suffering, it's almost impossible to find an objective problem with suffering on naturalism, or if God doesn't exist, because it goes back to the Izot problem, or even just some fundamental biological facts. You can measure almost everything in this world with statistics. This suffering has led to some certain chemicals in your brain releasing in your brain. This fire that you accidentally touch has kicked off some nervous cells and stuff like that. You can measure all of this stuff, but it doesn't mean that there's anything objectively wrong with that feeling. Just as like you see a beautiful painting and there's some other chemicals which get out in your brain. Well, what's objectively better, one over the other, right? I mean, it's that necessary for you. It's, and in Jordan B. Peterson's term, you need that narrative structure underlying your reality in order to explain, or in order for you to have some sense of objectivity, to have that explanation for why suffering is so bad. And when you start from suffering under this observation or this worldview, this structure, you soon see that suffering points nowhere to naturalism, or at least I should rephrase myself to say suffering, objective suffering, points nowhere to naturalism, but directly to man's need for God, which then furtherly strengthens your philosophical argumentation, which is, well, if suffering does point to God and suffering does exist, then, well, you should believe in God. And now we have more reason to believe in God from a philosophical and also a suffering or psychological aspect. That's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that those are good thoughts. The one thing I thought about is it seemed kind of bizarre to say start with suffering, but like regardless, I was thinking about like I've been to like sub-Saharan Africa in a place where there's tremendous suffering, and those people believe in God. So it seems like to me like the people who experience the most suffering in this world, at least, is like humans who can like cognitively like examine and analyze things. These are people who believe in God, and they have the most suffering. So I think that's just kind of like an interesting counterpoint to what Alex is saying. And then I think I'd agree with a lot of what you say, Josh. I just don't see like how you get from suffering to, well, okay, there's just no God, just almost like a priori, in terms of like a starting point. So, and then I think a lot of like people who believe, they don't believe in God because of like philosophical arguments. Like most of my believers I know, they don't believe in God because they read like the contingency argument or the Kalam or something. They believe in God because it makes the most sense of reality and the real experience and understanding of his presence in reality. So I don't know. I just think there's some issues with Alex's starting point, though. It is very interesting. So, yeah.
So I completely agree with you with the point on the suffering in Africa and stuff like that, because I mean, at the end of the day, what I think we all see is that people need to have meaning. People need to have meaning to act out of life. And these people in Africa, they can't find a way out of their situation in the most direct way, in the sense that they don't have that opportunity. All they do is they're starving, and it is a very sad and dark situation to be in. That, I mean, I've been in Africa as well, and it's a very beautiful culture and a beautiful people, and it's just very sad to see the suffering there. But I've also, at the same time, I've never seen as many strong believers in all my travels than in Africa, and it's something that's always been in my heart. And I think there's something which I think Jesus says. It's like, what is it for a man to lose his soul and gain the world, or something along those lines? I mean, if you could choose between heaven or having no suffering in this world, I'm sure you'll choose heaven every single day. And if it's true that suffering does lead or does provide the opportunity for people to choose God over like atheism, or choose God and reach heaven despite the suffering, then I think that suffering is completely justified, no matter how severe it is, because that beauty and that relationship with God is so much greater, as seen in the people in Africa, and as seen by so many people who suffer all around the world, who actually turn to God as a result of suffering. It's a choice, it's a challenge that we all must face. But if we take advantage of it and use it to strengthen ourselves, we have a great opportunity on our hands to really strengthen our walk with Christ. And that's something which I think is very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, there's a debate between Alex and Inspiring Philosophy on like the problem of evil, and like I can almost hear it again, where Alex just kind of assumes that like suffering is just bad, like all suffering is just bad. But if you think about it, like a world without any suffering, just a priori, no chance for like moral growth and such, sounds like a pretty bad world as well, almost. And you can talk about like heaven and such, but I don't think it's a symmetrical thing there. But so I just think there's a lot of things where Alex just kind of assumes here that suffering is just this bad thing that shows that God probably does not exist, and it just doesn't seem like that's the case. So we're like, that's the end of the clips we have, Josh. We'll head towards wrapping things up here. Do you have any kind of like last thoughts, things you want to share with regards to this debate or anything else?
I mean, I'll just like to let the audience know that I do actually have a note on my blog, Apologetics for All, where you could find my notes for this debate and also for other debates that I've reviewed in the past. So if you're interested in this debate and you don't have time to actually watch the entire debate, then just go onto the blog and just read it, just check it out. And it's handwritten in my debate writing, so I mean, it might be a bit messy, but I mean, you should get a general idea of what we've talking about, both what Bishop Barron says and also what Alex O'Connor says. So if you're interested in that, just feel free to go check it out. And it's there for you. It should be out quite soon.
Yeah, no, that's great. And there's a link down below to Josh's channel, his YouTube channel, Apologetics for All, great stuff there, and as well to the full debate if you want to listen to this really good conversation between Alex and Bishop Barron. But I think that's about, we're all going to be done here. We're going to be done here. Sorry, I can't talk. So if you're new to here in Apologetics, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, and if you enjoy the show, you can support us on patreon.com/adherent apologetics for as little as $1 a month. Really appreciate everyone's support through there if you enjoy the channel, or you can press join and become a YouTube member. But if nothing else needs to be said, Josh, thank you so much for your time. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone who's listening. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate you being with us, Wesley, Curity, Susan, everyone else. And Alex, if you ever listen to this review, you're great. We disagree. But you're a great speaker, a great debater, and you have a lot of good ideas. So yeah, thank you everyone, and God bless.